What we're going to be going over here is job order costing, and we're going to look at overhead variance analysis for job orders that we have. And we're going to be comparing our actual versus our applied overhead when you're talking about overhead variances. So what we're going to have here, we're going to have both a variable and a fixed overhead that we're looking at, and we're going to have the actual overhead costs that we have accumulated for the period here, and they're going to go into a manufacturing overhead control account here, but it's going to come in at some budgeted rate here that we have for the period for both our variable and our fixed overheads. And then it's going to be applied here based on the actual hours that are used here times the the variable overhead and the fixed overhead rates that we're going to be calculating. So we're going to have a difference here between what we've applied here, the overhead that we've applied versus our actual overhead costs. And then we're going to also have a difference between our budgeted overhead that we have for the period and our actual overhead costs. And those we're going to have to determine the variances on. So the first thing we have to do is, let's go down here. So for our reference key that we're going to use, VOR stands for the variable overhead rate, FOR stands for the fixed overhead rate, AHU stands for the actual hours that are used, and DH stands for the total budgeted direct labor hours that we're going to have for the period. And those are referred to as the denominator hours because they are in the denominator of our formula here to determine our fixed overhead rate and our variable overhead rate. So looking at what we've budgeted for the year, that would be for our variable overhead rate, we take our total variable costs and divide them by the total direct labor hours. So total variable costs, we have $144,000 that we budgeted, and our direct labor hours, we're estimating those to be 4,800 hours. So that's going to give us a $30 per hour here variable overhead rate for each direct labor hour that we use. And then for our total fixed overhead rate, our fixed overhead rate, we take our total fixed cost, $240,000 were budgeted, and our total direct labor hours, again, 4,800 direct labor hours we're looking at. So that's going to give us a $50 per hour here fixed overhead rate. So every direct labor hour, $50 here is going towards our fixed overhead rate. And again, those are budgeted amounts, and there are per direct labor hour rates that we're looking at. Okay, so now let's go up and do our analysis here. So taking our miscellaneous counts, this is for both our fixed and our variable overhead, they would have been accumulated here at their actual cost. Our variable amount is we're accumulated $121,500 here for the variable overhead. Fixed overhead we have at $242,500. Those are the actual costs. So our total amount here is $364,000. So that's the actual overhead cost that we have for the period or for the year here. Now going into our manufacturing overhead control account, both for our total fixed and our variable overheads here, we would have, for our budgeted amount here, we're going to take the budgeted fix that we have for the period, and that's going to be $240,000 here. That's going to be our fixed overhead rate here at $50 per hour times, in this case, those total direct labor hours that we budgeted at 4,800 hours here. And that's going to give us $240,000 here in our budgeted fixed overhead. And then for our actual variable, that's based on our actual hours. So our actual hours that we used have here for direct labor hours was 4,100 hours times our variable overhead rate here at $30 per hour. So that's going to give us $123,000. So our total budgeted fixed $240,000, put our actual variable at $123,000 is going to give us our budgeted amount here that we have, and our budgeted fixed and our actual variable at $363,000 a total amount. Okay, so now we're going to apply our overhead here based on the variable overhead rate here of $30 here, plus our fixed overhead here of $50 per hour. So a total of $80 here for our variable and our fixed overhead on a per hour basis, times the actual hours we've used here, 4,100 hours. So this is what we're going to apply it at, that based on our overhead rates that we budgeted here times the actual hours used. So that gives us 328,000 hours here. That's what what's going to move out of our manufacturing overhead account here into the work in process. So that's what we're applying to our work in process or our inventory here, $328,000. So we've got a difference here. Our actual overhead, $364,000, versus the 328,000 here in the our total applied amount here of overhead based on our actual hours used and our overhead rates here. And then we also have a difference here based on the budgeted amount. That was that budgeted fixed here and our actual variable amounts here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to compare our actual overhead here, 364,000, to what we've budgeted here and our actual variable at 363,000. And those are going to really be what we call spending variances. So for our variable overhead, the spending variance is going to be this. They take our actual amount here, 121,500 here for the variable overhead. Then you compare it to the variable overhead rate that we have here, $30 per hour, times the actual hours used here, 4,100 hours. So we got $123,000 here. So that's really a favorable amount here because we've allocated 123,000 here based on our rates and our actual hours used, but we actually use only 121,500. So we're going to have a credit amount here, favorable amount by $1,500. And then the other thing is we have to work with this fixed overhead again for a spending variance. This is again where we take our actual fixed overhead. That was $242,500 here in our fixed overhead actual amount, and then we compare it to the budgeted here. So our fixed overhead rate here, we had $50 per hour times those denominator hours or total direct labor hours that were budgeted, the 4,800 hours here. So $50 times per hour times 4,800 hours is $240,000. So we're, based on our budgeted amount here, we're unfavorable. We actually used 242,500 versus the 240,000 that we were budgeted for here. So we've used $2,500 more in overhead here is unfavorable. And that again is our fixed overhead spending variance. So we've got between our variable overhead here spending variance, we have a favorable amount here, $1,500 credit amount here. When we say favorable, we credit it or we reduce our, in this case, our variable overhead by that amount here, versus the debit or the unfavorable amount here of $2,500. So the net difference here is really an unfavorable amount here of $1,000, simply the difference between our $2,500 unfavorable and our $1,500 favorable. So unfavorable, that would be you debit your, in this case, your fixed overhead account for that amount. Okay, so that is our spending variance. Okay, now the other differences between what we have here in our work in process, or what we've applied here, that $328,000 in overhead versus what we have here for our budgeted plus our actual variable of $363,000. So this is what we were going to is called the idle capacity variance, and it's really based for our underutilized capacity here. It's going to, if we have an unfavorable amount. Had we have a favorable amount, then it would be actually over our, we would have used, it wouldn't be underutilized, it would be overutilized capacity. But in this case, we're going to have underutilized capacity because we're going to be have an unfavorable amount here of $35,000. And that's simply, we'll do the calculations here, but that's really looking at the $328,000 here versus the what we have here, what we've applied here versus what we had in our budgeted fixed and our actual variable of $363,000. Okay, so let's go and let's determine this $35,000 worth of idle capacity variance here is unfavorable. So it's really taking what we want to do here. You take your budgeted fixed overhead and then you compare it to your applied fixed overhead. So our budgeted fixed overhead, what was that? It was $50 per hour here times the 4,800 hours here for $240,000. So that's what we had budgeted. Applied overhead, fixed overhead, that would have been the $50 per hour here times 4,100 hours. Those are the actual hours that we used here. That gives us $205,000. So the difference, $240,000 here that we have, we budgeted at 4,800 for 4,800 hours versus the 4,100 here that was actually applied or actual usage here, 205,000 gives us what? That $35,000 worth of unfavorable or idle capacity variance. And that was 240,000 less the 205,000 for debit your idle capacity variance here for 35,000. And you can also look at it in these terms. Remember, the reason we have that here is we've got that our budgeted total direct labor hours was sitting here at 4,800 hours, and we used only 4,100 direct labor hours for the period or for the year. So we got really 700 hours here that we had to account for, and that is unfavorable because we had budgeted more than we actually used. Now, had we the other would have been true here. Had our budgeted fixed overhead here been less than the applied fixed overhead, then we would have had a favorable amount. We would have had a favorable amount. But in this case, it was unfavorable here by the difference between our budgeted fixed overhead and our applied fixed overhead. That was our idle capacity variance. And then if we just go through these variances here to see add everything up here to get our total variance was 36,000 unfavorable, because what do we have? And going back to our numbers here, our actual overhead cost was 364,000 here versus what we applied here at 328,000. And that total difference here is 36,000 unfavorable. And it really comes into the fact that we had 1,500 here in favorable overhead as a spending variance for variable overhead here, 2,500 here in fixed overhead that was unfavorable, and then we had the idle capacity variance here of 35,000. So netting everything out, this is where we come up with the 36,000 here of unfavorable overhead. But to make a point of it, if we go back here, when we look at what we are budgeted fixed plus our actual variable is 363,000, we had to compare it with our actual overhead cost here, 364,000. And the difference, that $1,000 difference here, was accounted for with between the variable overhead spending variance and the fixed overhead spending variance. And we calculated that was actual versus the whatever variable overhead rate we're working times the actual hours here for a variable overhead rate. And then for fixed hours, the fixed overhead spending variance was based on our actual amount and the difference between what we had actually budgeted. So for the variable overhead, that was based on our actual hours here, and for the fixed overhead, that was spending variances, that was based on the fixed overhead. And that is what we calculated up here. So if we go on back up here, again, it was based on our fixed overhead plus our variable overhead, that total amount there. And we have to compare it to our actual overhead cost for the period. And then the other thing was the idle capacity here of 35,000. That was simply the difference here we could look at in these terms, what we applied here at 328,000 versus what we budgeted for our budgeted fixed plus our actual overhead here, 363,000. So that's how we had to break up our we had to determine the difference between our actual overhead cost here and what we applied overhead cost. And that's how we would do it here for job order costing, and where we look at our overhead variance analysis. All right, just to follow up here, to go over our debits and credits here, to look at our variances and how they balance out. So if we start with our work in process account here for what we applied at 328,000, we had a debit amount for that. And then our idle capacity variance, we have a debit here of 35,000. And then if we move over to our fixed overhead spending variance, we have another debit here of $2,500. And then we would take our credit here and reduce our debit amount here by $1,500, the credit here of $1,500. And if you add everything up, it's going to balance with the credit here, our actual overhead cost of $364,000. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about those variances and how we balance them out with our debits and credits. So the difference here, a $364,000 credit amount here versus our work in process debit amount here of $328,000 balances with the debits and credits that we have for idle capacity variances and our spending variances. Okay, so that'll summarize it.